It's really good to be back and to see everyone again. Thank you for Krista for the songs, and Joan for your words. So much has happened since January when I was last here, and I was really grateful to get Leslie's invitation to come back. And she wrote that she would love for me to talk about what it means to be a human being, humankind, resilience, inspiration, your journey, anything you didn't get a chance to tell us that you would like to, joy, and remember 20 minutes. I said, okay, I would love to. And then I thought, okay, where to begin? And what I kept coming back to again and again was this question that always comes up when I talk about my journey and many steps in my journey. And that question is, so much suffering. Do you ever just want to give up? And my response is always the same, that in working for social change and for human rights, we do see the worst that human beings are capable of. We see power over, domination, force, used to break people and the earth and to deliberately disempower. But we also see the best that human beings are capable of, and we see a different kind of power, one that reaches for healing, for truth, for justice, for wholeness, again and again and again. And it is these people in the very midst of the suffering and the work that we do together that inspires and empowers and brings joy. And I think for me, this is this mystery that Krista Tippett speaks of in her book, Becoming Wise, that was gifted to me by Atlee, one of your wise women. And she says, I am emboldened by the puzzling, redemptive truth that we are made by what would break us. And she says that this is a thread that runs through all of her conversations. And these are times that would break us. And I don't think I need to elaborate or add one more word about that. We can feel disempowered by what we witness, and it can be tempting to give up. Recently, Stephen Hawking, the great astro-scientist, physicist, said as much when he made headlines saying, we've reached a breaking point, time to abandon planet Earth and colonize outer space. And in a puzzling, paradoxical way that happens when we are up against what would break us, I found myself emboldened. And I found myself saying a really huge no. We don't need to go on colonizing one more thing with the same domination system that brought us to this very breaking point. And I found myself with Krista Tippett and many, many others who say this is the time to directly and wisely address the human condition and begin to grow it up. And this is the time to shift paradigms from a system of power over, of domination, of conquering and force and taking and subjecting and blowing up things that created the mess that we're in, to a different kind of power, the power that we need to stay on this planet Earth, to belong to it, to find our place in the web of life as human beings who live in a way that all things may live well in the power of wholeness. And so I thought how to talk about this. And I could talk about theory and a PowerPoint with bullets. And then I thought the best way for me is to tell stories. And I quickly had a list of 10 of them. And I had 20 minutes. So I made it 4 thumbnails, just a taste of this power of wholeness that I think is all around us, emergent and calling us forth and waking us up just as things are breaking down. So in January, I made my first trip this year to Washington, D.C. I was going to work on the Berta Cáceres Human Rights in Honduras Act, which we needed to reintroduce to this year's Congress. And I was dreading going to D.C. I had missed the Women's March. I was coming right after that. So Trump was in the White House, busy reminding everybody about the big numbers at the inauguration and on a roll with the executive orders. And the silver lining was that I was going to stay with my dear friends Jean and Scott, who are a huge support system. So I'm landing at the airport in DCA, and I see my phone is lighting up. And there's all these messages saying, call Jean and Scott right away. You got to get a hold of Jean. Have you reached Jean yet? Jean and Scott are getting arrested at the White House, and they need to give you the key before they go to jail. And I'm not even off my plane yet, and my support system is going to jail. And I thought, so that morning, the executive order for the Muslim ban had been issued, and an interfaith vigil had been called in front of the White House. So I headed straight there, and I ran into this huge crowd that was gathering. And I found old friends from some 3 years of decades of work for peace and social justice, and a whole new generation of diverse, talented, articulate activists and leaders. And in the midst of that huge crowd, I found Jean, and she gave me the key to her house, and I wrote my cell phone number on her arm in ink, and she said, I'll call you from jail. So we stood in this sea of diversity as representatives from every religious and spiritual tradition spoke one after another of the mandate to love your neighbor, to welcome the stranger. And a rainbow of people vowed to stand with each other, to protect each other, to love one another, affirming every intersection of race, class, gender, culture, sexual and spiritual expression. And we felt what it is to be safe, to be held, to belong, to be wisely grown-up human beings. And I walked alongside Jean and Scott and about 30 others who were going to do civil disobedience as they made their way out onto 14th Street in front of the White House at the height of rush hour. And they sat down on the pavement. And people brought forward these huge banners of these enormous monarch butterfly wings, a symbol of all that we stand to lose. And they fluttered down softly onto the street in front of the White House, where another banner hung high in the sky from a construction crane that had been scaled by Greenpeace activists the day before in response to the executive order on the Dakota Access Pipeline that said, resist. And this thick rainbow of people poured onto 14th Street, singing, we will stand with each other, we will protect each other, we will love one another. And it was powerful and inspiring, and there was joy. And the police barricades went up, and they took position on foot, on motorcycles with dogs, and the vans pulled in to make the arrests, and the people kept singing. And the crowd swelled as people got off from work. And the press was everywhere covering this vigil that had been organized on a few hours' notice by word of mouth. And as it got dark, thousands of cell phones were held high and lit the night, and people kept singing and chanting, we will stand with each other, we will protect each other, we will love one another. And it was getting cold. And I went to check on Jean, who weighs all of about 98 pounds, and I said, do you need a sweater? And she was beaming, and she said, no, it's all good. She said, but the police are waiting for this crowd to disperse, so it might take a while before they arrest us. So I found a place to sit on a wall next to a police officer that was part of a canine unit. And I said, I know you're working, but can I just say hello to your dog? And he said, sure. And he told me his name, and we had this long talk about how I would be able to retire with this dog. And although it was unspoken, I could tell that the heart of this police officer was totally with us. And by about 9 o'clock at night, the police quietly packed up and rolled away. No arrests this night. And we made our way home, infused with the power of wholeness. The next day, we had appointments on the Hill, and congressional staffers were reeling from one executive order, statement, and tweet to the next. Their phones were ringing off the hook, they were flooded with emails, and they staggered out to meet us as if we were some welcome relief. They said, we're in shock, everything's up for grabs. They said it's time for us to grow up in this country, to take seriously what it means to be citizens, to have a democracy. And we knew something different was happening because they were really listening to us as we spoke of places where US policy has helped to destroy democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and where everything already is up for grabs. And we said, and these people will be our teachers now. And we spoke of the ways they defend human rights, civil liberties, and democracy at every turn, and how they stand with and protect and love each other. And these staffers said, thank you, what can we do? And later that day, thousands and thousands of people flooded airports across the country in massive spontaneous protests of the Muslim ban and the border wall and power that divides and dominates and destroys. And by the end of the week, I was energized and empowered, and I didn't want to leave that wholeness. In March, Tom and I finally made it up north, our first trip to that beautiful land. And we were there on March 2nd. That was the day the Berta Cáceres Human Rights in Honduras Act was reintroduced into Congress again. And that was the first anniversary of her murder. And we wandered the edges of that watery place and found ourselves at the Eowyn Cultural Center of the Grand Traverse Band of the Ottawa and Chippewa. And we had the warmest welcome. And before we knew it, over 3 hours had flown by as we heard about this community and all it is doing to restore wholeness to the human and natural worlds. They talked about the road that goes up the peninsula and how it separated the turtle nesting grounds from the water, and how for years their Turtle Clan people had helped these baby turtles cross the road so they wouldn't get run over by the cars. And that they had gotten the resources together to build a tunnel that passed under the road so that the turtles could pass safely. And this year, the turtles used that tunnel for the first time and passed safely. And they talked about the way that they have set aside land to rewild native plants and medicines, and how they're planting grasses to filter agricultural runoff that's going into the lake. And they talked about their water protectors. And I said, maybe you've heard of Berta Cáceres. Maybe you've bumped into her picture or her name at Standing Rock. And they said, of course we know her. And they said, sign her into our guest book. And they gave us medicine bundles. And as people made prayers for Berta at the Rio Gualcarque in Honduras and recommitted to her struggle to protect water, we made our prayers for her and for water protectors at the Eowyn Cultural Center on the shores of Lake Michigan. Grateful that in the midst of so much brokenness, there is this power of wholeness. In April, Tom, who is the finder of everything, remember? He comes home and says, there's this horse that's in a really bad situation. Do you think you could come take a look at it? And I said, okay. And what happened next is a talk in itself, but here's just the thumbnail. People all around us right here, many are living on the edge of extreme poverty, and they have worked hard their entire life. And sometimes circumstances combine and push them over the edge. And when that happens, those in their care go over that edge with them. And that was the case of this horse, who was in a small pen in deep mud and freezing water. And his mother, the mare, had weakened and died that winter, and she was still in the pen with him. And the problem was that this was a young stallion with no training, had never been haltered, was terrified of ropes. And he was in mud so deep that there was no footing, so you couldn't get in there with him, and we couldn't get him out. And he was literally stuck in this death trap. And once I saw him, I was committed. So I went to my friend Ula at the Sundance Center, and I told her about it. And she said, we need to call in my friend Becky, who's a trusted vet. And we all three went to assess the situation and agreed, very complicated. The temperature was rising, so we had a really short window to operate in before the whole thing became septic and would trigger a scenario where most likely this horse would be put down. And even if we could get him out, and if we could move him, where to find a place where there was strong enough fencing and no mares to hold a traumatized, untrained stallion. And we concluded this was mission impossible. And someone used the word lost cause. But this wild horse was at a breaking point, and he filled our hearts, and he was showing up in our dreams, and he would gently nudge us, saying, "Come on, we can do this, trust me." And he occupied our thoughts, and we couldn't get anything else done. And at one point, I said to Ula, "I'm really sorry I got you into this." And she stood up very tall and looked at me very wisely, and she said, "Jenny, this is what we do." And so we kept at it. And we began to see that something was acting through us, and it was assembling a team of caring human beings who were stepping up to help in whatever way they could to address this impossible mission. Someone had just the right kind of bolt cutters for the fence, and someone had a trailer and a truck, and someone brought hay, and someone had the right size halter, and someone had lime and blankets to bury the mare. And 3 vets, all women, volunteered their services. We just had to come up with money to pay for the meds. And a microbrewery called Big Heart, no kidding, calls Ula out of the blue and says, "We're going to do a collection on Derby Day, and we want to give it to a horse that needs to be rescued. Do you happen to know of one?" Know of one. And we were beginning to see that this is what happens when we face the mess we're in instead of turning away. We experience a power greater than our own, a grace. And we build community and we find a way. And we knew that this way could not be the old way of domination and fear and force and submission and ropes and whips and hurting this animal. Though this was offered at every turn. We knew that the kind of power we needed to get out of this mess would need to be very powerfully gentle. And it needed to build trust. And so on Thursday of Holy Week, which in the Christian tradition is the day that Jesus washes the feet of the disciples, deliberately challenging the power over paradigm, teaching that no one is ever less than or below anyone else, and that we are to love and to serve one another. A group of us gathered at the fence, and we spoke to this 4-year-old stallion of our intention, and we told him we loved him, and we asked for his trust, and we cut open that fence. And 6 hours later, this horse stood in his new home in a peaceful woods, gelded, vaccinated, and in the care of a man who's a new friend, whose story I'm just beginning to learn. But in a nutshell, 2 tours in Vietnam with a riverine unit, starting at age 17, that almost broke him. Heavy exposure to Agent Orange that caused damage to his heart. A man who has, as an act of conscience, will not accept U.S. government money he's entitled to as a victim because, he says, he seeks a deeper healing. A man of peace and truth-telling and paradigm-shifting, a powerfully gentle human being. He speaks of his Ojibwe and Amish grandparents, one grandfather who taught him to walk barefoot on the earth every day, even in the winter, and another who plowed with percherons, using only his voice to move them, a man whose bond of trust with this wild horse became much more important than the right kind of fencing and key in making our mission impossible possible. And this lost cause gave us all a visceral sense of empowerment, community, and joy. Last one, May. I was helping my friend Robin in her fair trade store in Saugatuck, and a couple walked in, admired the beadwork, and they were on their way back out, and I admired a piece of beautiful beadwork on the band of his hat. And he said, "Megwitch." And I said, "You're welcome." And I don't know how to say it in Potawatomi language. And he stopped and he turned around. And he said, "Do you know how many people know that word?" And I said, "Not enough." And he said, "Right." And I said, "Thanks for all the good work your community is doing, because I see it in the news." And he said, "Are you talking about the mascots?" And he went on to explain that he was leading the effort to get a local sports team that calls themselves the Savages to change its name. And he said, "Because we are not savages. Those who came and destroyed land and committed genocide, that is savage. What's happening at Standing Rock today is savage." And we had a deep conversation about historic trauma and resistance and healing and resilience. And they left, and I stayed thinking about all we had talked about. And after about an hour or so, I thought, I wonder if they're still in town. And I grabbed this basket of woven friendship bracelets and walked out to the street, and there they were right then, getting into their truck that was parked right in front of the store. And so I went over and I said, "Here, please take one." And they said, "Miigwech," again. And then they taught me how to say, "You're welcome." And we talked about many things, and we talked about water protectors. And of course, they also knew about Berta Cáceres. And then they gave me this gift. They said, "We came here to see the water because it's sick, and it's not the right color, and the whorls are not going in the right direction. And people are walking down the streets side by side, but they're staring into their telephones." They said, "It's one thing to be a human, and it's another thing to be a human being. It's our responsibility to be human beings, to live in a way that all things may live well, to help the water and the earth and all living things heal, so we can look each other in the eye and come back into the power of wholeness." And he said, "My name is Redbird." And he's looking me in the eye at this time. He said, "So when you see that red bird out there, remember me and think about what we talked about today." And as it happens, there is a pair of cardinals in the meadow behind my house. And now I'm beginning to think there's more than one pair, because since that encounter, I see those red birds more and more and more. And I pause and I remember what we talked about that day. And I reflect on what it means to be a human being right now in this moment with all that is going on, our global crisis, the magnitude of the stakes of all that could break us. And in that puzzling and paradoxical way that is a mystery, I am emboldened to try again and again and again to be a human being. And to me, it has something to do with facing the mess we're in without turning away, welcoming the stranger, loving one another, protecting human rights, civil rights, democracy, resisting, standing in solidarity, shifting paradigms, doing what we can to restore wholeness to the human and natural worlds, being community, committing to mission impossibles and lost causes, and finding a way through that is powerfully gentle, that comes from the heart and builds trust, so that no matter what is going on around us, we never give up. Because we experience again and again empowerment, inspiration, joy, and grace that comes from living in the power of wholeness. Thank you.